We're going to start with showing a very short film, because that's going to help us explain what we're going to talk about. Usually we show this film in Zulu with subtitles, but because the screens are slightly smaller, you'll hear the English version. It's the same, my colleague Mpumi Ntombeni, who's doing the voice. So this is the English version, but you can also watch this film later online in the vernacular Zulu, which I think is really important. Because this is sacred Zulu mythology that we're going to show you.
So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the magic and the beauty of this animation. 5 minutes that took 5 years to make. And before we delve into what the process meant for law, for research, for change, let me just say very briefly that this was part of a much larger research collaboration. What we sought to create was fair research partnerships between researchers in the global north and in the global south, across legal sciences, marine sciences, social sciences, and the arts. For 6 years, we worked together and learned from one another. Sometimes we fell out and then found each other again. And I think we started off with an intuition, a commitment to integrate arts in our work, not as a form of communication, but as a self-standing and distinctive research contribution. And that was very much building on the work that Dylan had been done before, and then there's been just an incredible journey of learning that we've all embarked together. So I'll give the floor to Dylan to unpack for us how art is research in the first place.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see my screen now. Does it have the... Sorry, if we can move through that. Thank you. And I think it's important, so you can just see on the top corner there, the One Ocean Hub, which, as Elisa said, is in many ways like a sister to the MOTH network, where it's been artists and activists and scientists and lawyers coming together over 6 years, navigating some really difficult processes around ocean governance. And this film is just one of the many arts-based research processes that we developed. So I thought we chose this one because this has had some legal implications. But what's also very interesting is one of the things that we've noticed, or we were both passionate about when we started the Hub, was that artists often get relegated as being communicators of science, we're really good at translating and building translation protocols and helping different people understand each other. But often artists get neglected because they are researchers unto themselves. Art is a practice of research. And we really wanted to explore this deeper. And so I'll just show you, this is our colleague Kira Irwin. So Mpumi, who you heard, who's the voice of the film, we co-developed Empatheatre. It's a public storytelling community in South Africa collective. And we have researched all kinds of complex issues in society. And we create democratic processes for research using storytelling and story listening, more importantly. It's called Empatheatre because we try to create amphitheatres of empathy. And then through this storytelling process, usually through theatre, we have a post-show tribunal, a public tribunal, where we're able to surface evidences and testimonies. And one of the things we'd been working on for quite some time to the Hub was another play called Lalelo Lwandle, Listen to the Sea, which was building solidarity networks across the coastline against oil and gas mining, and why it had people were being lumped together saying it was community against the oil and gas company. But the reasons for why people didn't want the oil and gas were very different, but they were homogenized. And so we wanted a public dialogue and tribunal to surface those different reasons. One of them was that the ocean was sacred and that you can't mine heaven. But that was one of the slogans that emerged during the time. But there wasn't a sophisticated way of trying to create evidence of intangible heritage. The idea that for many Nguni descendant people, so Amaxhosa, Zulu, Tsonga, and others, the ancestors, the Bantu Nolwandle, or the Gogo Badala she talks about in the film, these ancestors you just saw in the deep sea, weren't being considered. And so Mpumi had done some interviews with Sangomas, traditional healers, and Zulu historians, And she came back quickly with this story, and that the Sangomas had said that the ancestors said, we need to focus on this story. And our colleague Kira quickly drew these two images. So I'm sure you noticed in the story that the journey that the soul takes in this kind of Zulu understanding of reincarnation is the same journey of the water cycle. So a scientist would describe it as evaporation and water cycle and the whole process of the currents in the ocean and so on. But in ancient Zulu understanding or Nguni tradition, the soul's journey through water is connected to this. And we realized that there was this opportunity to actually research this. If this was a provocation, let's uncover it together. And so this led us to what's been one of our major forms of research methodology in the One Ocean Hub, and something we would love to share with the MOTH community is the power, and it's come up in the last few days, is the power of call and response. And what Sol was saying about how the artists allow us to stay in the practice or the praxis or the phronesis. As much as beautiful outcomes come out, the 5 years of making this film was some of the richest, most diverse, not just interdisciplinary work, but transdisciplinary, transgressive, and I would also like to maybe say trans-epistemological, because we were able to move and weave ourselves, as de Souza Santos says, make entrances and exits between ways of knowing and being and doing. And so I'll quickly just show you a few things. This is, for example, the scripting of this play was such a long process because we had scientists, marine scientists, who had just done this massive project of mapping the different biomes of our oceans and our river systems, the aquatic system, to kind of call and respond with the traditional healers and the indigenous leaders and the customary rights holders and small-scale fishers around different values around these biomes. So a lot of the species you see in that film are really carefully and accurately called and responded. And so these are like early test animations of the work that would show to communities and to scientists to kind of democratize the research process. Here you also have the score. We worked with the Cape Town Opera and different vocal artists. And even the folly, so the sound of the water and in the film, was made with people's voices, because in the tradition, in the mythology, it's the songs of your ancestors, their voices, that pulls your soul into the deep sea. So there was a lot of call and response. This film was deeply democratic in how it was made. But it also brings us big questions around ethics of representation. How do we navigate sacred knowledge in research, but also in law? And how do we create alternative evidences? So I'll show you one quick example. Was one of the so we called and responded, how do we represent the ancestor? Which was a long process, many agreements and disagreements, and many iterations. And eventually, as Sangoma saying, that the ancestor should have no face, so that people could project their own families and their own isibongo, their own clans onto the ancestor's face. So these decisions that the ancestor also goes through its own journey in the ancestral realm or the amatwasa realm through the process. And even very expensive mistakes. The hat that the ancestor was wearing was incorrect. And it was actually a Zulu animator who added this hat, but this was culturally wrong. This is a hat you would wear at a wedding. And an ancestor wouldn't wear this hat. And so we had to go back frame by frame, because it's hand-drawn frame by frame, to edit out this to make sure that the representation, although we've in this process learned about the ethics of figuration rather than representation. I won't go into that now. But these are all the work of trying to stylize for the animation the species and getting sure that they move in the ways that the film would be interesting to scientists as much as it would be interesting to Sangomas. And this brings me to this point around artists as researchers, is this, and I've recently published around this, and with Elisa, this idea of, I wanted to try, and we managed to publish it with this infinity loop as an alternative to the dash, that when artists are making in relation to others, and Elena and I were talking about this earlier, is that as Erin Manning says, making is a form of thinking and theorizing. And when we are able to do this call and response and this iterative work, it kind of creates this like umbilical nourishment between meaning and making. The more you make, the more meaning emerges. The more meaning emerges, the deeper your making becomes. And this led to a very unexpected outcome, which I don't know if you want to take the reins here and just share what happened with this film.
Yeah, I mean, this film was used and recognized by judges in South Africa as legal evidence. Legal evidence in a case that now so many people around the world refer to, one of the most, iconic climate litigation cases against Shell and other oil and gas companies. But when we started, and this is where the kind of meaning making really takes such an incredible, powerful role, we weren't planning to engage in climate litigation. We were working with small-scale fishers, indigenous knowledge holders, to protect their intangible cultural heritage, to protect the deep seabed as the dwelling space of their ancestors. And we found in that process of also connecting with the marine scientists a shared agenda, let's say, in protecting marine biodiversity. And through that, again, a new space of alliance with the small fishers, also protecting their livelihoods, their vision of a dignified life on a dignified, just transition. So to me, what's incredible about this case is that it led, first of all, to protection of cultural rights, and through that, to the protection of participation rights, the recognition that indigenous knowledge holders should have been involved in an environmental impact assessment that had led to permitting noise blasting as a technique for exploring for oil and gas in the ocean, and eventually led to a victory that was also representing the will of many in South Africa and around the world to prohibit further oil and gas expansion, particularly in the ocean. And so to me, all of that shows how art was, in a way, foreshadowing the kind of the research that then we went ahead and doing, clarifying human rights obligations at the nexus of the ocean and climate, and through the basis on cultural heritage and biodiversity science. And in that process, we were all practicing art as a human rights-based process, and as a human rights-based process applies to research and applies to also judicial interpretation. And to me, it was extraordinary to see that victory, that recognition of such a diverse form of cultural heritage. But that was really just the beginning, and there were so many further potential opportunities that we developed, I think, through further application of the Empatheatre methodology, things that I always thought are, if not impossible, so hard to convey. Can we have intergenerational dialogue? Can we have gender transformative dialogue? Can we have interspecies dialogue as a human rights-based practice, and maybe more than humans-based practice? And I'll just let Dylan to explain how the art practice developed and how it allowed us to inform also UN processes where we're so far removed from those local realities and the opportunities of mutual understanding across diverse knowledge systems.
And maybe just to also add, I mean, one of the things that was after this is we've published a paper called When Ancestors Are Included in Ocean Decision-Making, which kind of fleshes out this case against Shell. It's clear to also just say that case was really won on the testimonies of small-scale fishers and indigenous peoples. And in this case, the art was allowed to support trying to deepen their arguments around the sacredness of the sea. So we're not claiming that our film won the court case, but we are saying that the solidarity practice and scholar activism that can support indigenous communities who are standing up to big forces like Shell allowed to deepen and create new evidences and also challenge evidence hierarchies. What counts as knowledge? In this case, intangible heritage, the sacredness of the sea, was recognized by the judge, and this is Judge Blum's. This was the first time a judge had actually recognized the existence of the ancestors in the sea. And he says it's not up to the court to decide whether ancestors live in the sea or not, but it is the court's decision to protect those who believe the ancestors in the sea need to be consulted. And that was a really significant moment. And And here's Mpumi, my colleague who we made the film with, and you heard her voice. We got to perform it thanks to Elisa, opened up. We've managed to tour our plays also, not just in communities on the ground and soccer fields and in public halls, but also at the UN and perform to UN assemblies. And here's Mpumi performing the film live to a big delegation. This is what you were asking me to talk about now, right?
Yes, so that was already, I think, incredible and beyond our dreams. But then the next piece of research and theater that Dylan and our colleague Pilile in the room as well, and many others worked on, kind of showed the even further incredible possibilities of art as a form of human and more than human rights practice and knowledge creation.
So yes, we really want to just acknowledge Pilile. She should be sitting in this third seat here. So this next project, and you can scan this QR code to watch the full documentary. It's an 18-minute documentary about the making of this play. It's a full 100% Zulu musical that retells the last 200 years of history based off almost 2 decades of research that Pilile has done in this community in Zulu, in vernacular language. So I'm just going to show you the first few minutes of this just so you can hear the voices of our amazing 13 young artivists that we collaborated with. This is on the border of Mozambique and South Africa. It's an area where there have been mass dispossessions during apartheid, where people were forcibly removed from their land for conservation, but kind of fortress conservation, and ideas of nature and wilderness that erased First Nations or Indigenous, or that those labels don't really work in South Africa, but the original peoples of South Africa were forcibly removed in the name of conservation, and their lives and livelihoods and practices in that land was completely erased. So what Pilile had been doing as an environmental scientist and a marine sociologist for many years is researching and building evidence for this Cozy Bay community. Oh yeah, we'll just hear their voices quickly because it's so important. Oh, wait, So you're hearing 13 young activists that we worked with over 2 years and created a counter-hegemonic mapping practice which tried to surface and managed to begin a very long process that we're going to be going in a couple of weeks back of mapping the different knowledges and stories and memories and timelines of Zulu and Tsonga history that has been removed. And some of the things that have surfaced are really powerful around customary forms of governance, customary forms of land management or marine and coastal management. Our constitution says that all marine parks or marine protected areas and conservation areas need to be co-managed. But at the moment, none are. We have over 40 MPAs, and none of them are co-managed. So it's a constitutional crisis and violation to the point that we have our own kind of George Floyd crisis in South Africa, where small-scale fishers have been shot and killed. The Nduli brothers were shot and killed on land that they'd won land tenure rights to by park rangers because they were considered poachers. And so in this project, what we did was try to work with young people, 13 young activists, and a council of elders, plus in Pilile's incredible body of research of ethnographies spanning these decades. And we used a community hall where we rewrote timelines going as far back as we can remember and then into mythological time. And then started mapping where people lived, where ancestral sites were, and so on. And through this process, these young people, you see them performing here, would go home and surface new stories. And then people would come to the community hall. And we did these 2-week workshops over 4 times a year over 2 years, And so people just kept adding to the history and building a new archive. And then we turned the archive into a musical, and we toured it around the region, which has now been seen by over 1,000 people. And after each performance was a public tribunal, which Pilile led and ran and facilitated, everything done in Zulu. And the main work here was to try to surface the ways in which there'd been elite capture, but also, and challenge that, and using satire and pathos and a fictional story and a fictional map, which is very close to reality, we could grapple with some of the governance issues. But it also surfaced some other interesting legal opportunities that we didn't anticipate, which Elisa and other lawyers helped us see. So I don't know if you want to mention those.
Yeah, and maybe also as a way of contrast with Lalela Luandle and Indlela Yukupila, what we saw here, which also hit me really strongly, and I was so privileged to go on tour for a little bit with the play, was how in this case we were chronicling a history of environmental science, conservation, environmental lawyers, misunderstanding and oppressing indigenous knowledge, misunderstanding completely the human and more than human relationships in that area. And so what art was doing there, what it showed to me that I've never experienced before, was how art itself, artistic expressions, were expressions of law. There was singing, clapping, and dancing that the communities were using as a way to manage this beautiful area and to communicate with hippos, with crocodiles, manage their own fishing practices. And it was the art itself that was law, and it was almost law co-developed with the other inhabitants of the area. And as, I guess, a Western trained lawyer, we struggle with understanding customary laws in very deep ways. And I think that having art both representing that struggle and, in fact, the oppression, but also giving that deep understanding, that experience of what customary law feels like and how it's developed, was really, for me, like a life-changing experience. And then the second, I guess, aspect there, which is something I had felt with the previous work, but it became even more, an even deeper understanding of how we can't have meaningful conversation, transformative conversations about past injustices and current injustices without art, because we won't have the element of not just knowing maybe parts of history that are and are recognized as wrong, but also a sense of owning those episodes of oppression and injustice as something that we each individually wish to do something about, and going beyond what may have been our individual experience, our individual responsibilities in that history, but really moving away, I think, from our predetermined ideas coming into that performance, and finding yourself empathizing, feeling to some extent some embodied forms of what it's like to experience that injustice over generation, and starting to imagine what could I do about this situation? What role can I play? And we've seen time and again how all the people, no matter what kind of walk of life and what kind of power they had, they all asked themselves that question in a very new and fresh way. And I've never seen that in any other space. And I just thought this is what's always been missing in any other decision-making space, in any other space where we hear about injustices. We may understand them to some extent, but we never really feel that possibility and that comprehension of being ready to look at how we can change things, taking on board intergenerational injustice, living memories that still shape the reality we're seeing. And in ways also that are so different from reality, imagining how young women speak into power, what would that look like and feel like, and how that immediately takes hold in the audience. And so to me, that just opened up even more possibilities, what we can do that seems impossible in our usual reflection or decision-making spaces that art makes possible and alive and full of, I think, fill people with imagination as well as responsibility.
And maybe just one quick anecdote that's, I think, very useful for MOTH is the talking to hippos. So one of the things that was really, that surfaced from this process was before the park existed and before the fortress conservation happened, they're connected to, and I will show you a short clip so you can see, connected to the ways in which customary governance was managed. There, in the estuary, a way of fishing where you would corral fish using a basket weaving method called isibaya, or fish kraals. But when scientists came, they wrongly called them fish traps because they didn't know that, because they only looked in a short amount of time when they were doing it. But over time, there was a call and response with the fish and with the hippos and the crocodiles through song and through practices where the weave of the baskets was, or the corrals was adjusted according to how the different species were doing. But also, there was a way of clapping and singing when you arrived at the river over generations that habituated humans and hippos living together, that the hippos would move to the other side of the river. And the crocodiles were so freaked out by this whenever the hippos would just do this mass migration, they would follow the hippos. And these are the stories that came out in these workshops. And then people could safely work with the fish kraals without being attacked by hippos or crocodiles. If they did get attacked, it was usually connected to someone had broken a taboo. And the story went that if you had not followed the traditions and the practices, and you hadn't adjusted your weave of your baskets to allow smaller fish through in that season because they weren't doing so well, then you would the hippos would hold you accountable. And then later, there were when the white man came and built these fortress conservations, they had said, "Oh no, let us just build a very short fence, up to your knees, to keep the hippos out, but you can just step over and carry on your practice of the isibaya." When they came back, it was a 2-meter high fence, electric, and they couldn't access the river. And so, but there was what we are surfacing, and what Pelila's incredible work and her team is really bringing up and is these traditional ways of real incredible co-management and living well with other more than human beings. So if you want to know more about both this project and the other one, the two theatre-based programs, because the animation came out of Lalelo Lwantle, which is the first one. We've made these impact reports, which were really fun to make, which kind of unpack these two projects. And also, if you want to listen to the radio play version of Lalelo Lwantle, which we haven't gone into that project at all, really, just briefly mentioned it. You can listen to the radio play here with headphones. It's online.
Yes, and so, I mean, again, what I've been thinking in terms of like the possibilities that were opening up for us as we were working with this was like how much more can we open up spaces of decision-making and understanding in ways that just seem inconceivable. What I was saying earlier is already around how through these two plays we understood how we were able to open up conversations with decision makers and researchers who had been at loggerheads in public dialogues, pro-conservation, against conservation, misunderstanding, and not accepting some of the historical responsibilities. And then after this experience, this aesthetic experience, finding themselves kind of being able to set aside what they were coming in to say time and again in many conversations, a preset agenda, and rather being open to discover how could we relate to one another differently and work in service of those communities and rethink our understanding of human and more than human relationship in the area. But I guess I wasn't aware we could do, and yet I think this methodology allowed to do, was go even deeper into understanding the histories and the oppressions of more than humans, and have a dialogue and an understanding around basically interspecies dialogue, and how would that then inform our own understanding and our own responsibilities. And that's the next performance that Dylan can tell us more about.
Yeah, so from what we learned from there, we just finished touring for the last year a play called Unruly, which deals with urban baboons in Cape Town and communities in conflict, and it's supposedly called a conflict, but it's mainly predominantly privileged white communities who are kind of upset by the ways that baboons are ruining their gardens or raiding their homes. But it allowed us to create a very carefully constructed sociological process and intervention and tribunals to actually use theatre and arts to have a deeper conversation about understanding where they exist and the history of the land and the Group Areas Act, and that they were all living on stolen land, and maybe the baboons were holding them accountable to ways in which their privileges were. So this is a new project, and we've just done 2 runs of it. We have another one coming up in July, and it's created a different kind of tribunal process around interspecies communication, in this case between baboons and people, but in the end it actually became a deeper project around how do we get privileged communities to start actually thinking about the land that they've lived on in a privileged and occupied way. So that's been really amazing, and there's more coming soon around a play about environmental defenders and elephants, which opens early next year, and we're going to do lots of work with the UN around that as well, and protections for environmental defenders and whistleblowers. But before we close, I just want to wave to our One Ocean Hub team, if you can put up your hands there. This incredible team. This is a fraction of how many?
Over 120.
120 researchers, thinkers, of what emerged as the One Ocean Hub community. And it's in the same way we like the sister to MOTH, and we imagine it growing in the same way, and us now sharing and learning from each other. But I just wanted you to also see this beautiful film that this team has made with Pelile about this research. And so it's just the first 2 minutes of it, and you can just see the context in which this play has emerged, and you can see those fish crawls. So who you saw there was Jerry Mngunu, who's one of the elders who helped us in the project, and he leads the Cozy Bay displaced community that Pelile has been working with for all this time, and other community members there. And if you want to watch the full documentary, which is very beautiful, and you can see Pelile's other mapping work. I know today there were some amazing projects around mapping, that we would love to share. So please, if you can scan that and watch it. If we do have more time, I'll just quickly show 2 more promising, exciting things. One of the things that came out, this is a virtual reality 3D exhibition made with the Hub around, different artists surfacing intangible heritage around the ocean. The exhibition was called Our Ocean is Sacred, You Can't Mine Heaven. So you can actually, if you scan that code, you can go onto a 3D and walk through the exhibition of different artists who created evidences also in the time of the Hub.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I have a collection of questions here, so we'll just dive in. And the first one relates to engaging scientists, and a related one relates to engaging lawyers and legal practitioners and judges. And the both of you in this project, and I'm sure beyond, have had wonderful luck and traction and momentum in that regard. But could you speak to what you see as the trends and actually what works to kind of build this bigger tent of engagement as artists and storytellers, people who sort of can occupy multiple different sort of domains and capabilities to better engage scientists and people from the law?
Yeah, maybe just to say it's not a linear process.
Yeah, unpack that a little bit for folks.
Yeah, I think it's a process. We were discussing this also earlier today. It's a process of personal transformation. I mean, the art and what it shows about what you thought you were doing in good faith and realize maybe for a long time you've been contributing to injustices. I mean, many researchers within the project realized that while they were trying to pursue a certain form of justice, they might have been blind or not realizing that they were actually contributing or perpetuating certain forms of injustices. And these are very hard realities to come to terms with. And yet they become a moment of profound transformation. And when you realize how else you can be and how else you can work with others and relate and understand their experiences of oppression, of discrimination, and then find a new space of co-creation. So it's a process where I think we've also learned how to hold the space, to be patient. I've learned, I think, to be more patient than I was when I started, to give the time and the space for people to go through the emotions of that transformation and realizations. And I think Dylan has shared a lot of also good practices about how you hold that space carefully and that kind of color response, and let, I think, those realizations emerge and new forms of working together take shape. But I think at the end of it, I think we all realize how we would never have realized our own ideals of protecting the environment and protecting human rights on our own. Even with all our good intentions, the best tools in our sciences, we were always doomed to failure because we were disconnecting with those other knowledge holders, and we would never have been able to work with them and co-create with them without going through the process of realizing how until then we had been part of problematic practices that we've been taught, and we haven't discussed within our own circles because we were missing other parts of understanding of that experience.
And I would think one of the things that was really, I think conflict is hard, and especially in transdisciplinary research, and not interdisciplinary only, but transdisciplinary, when the idea is that you're going to both be changed out of the process. Both your disciplines are going to not be the same by the time you finish, or how you practice your discipline was really could sometimes create an existential crisis for some scientists and even some sociologists. Some sociologists felt that their reputation would be tarnished if they were even just seen in the same room as a certain scientist. And we had to kind of bring these people together. And I think, so don't be afraid of a bit of generative tension.
And how did you do that, Dylan?
So, well, one of the things was to create spaces and processes for storytelling and story listening. And we developed a thing called the living aulas, which we had borrowed from transgressive learning theory in educational sociology, which were regular ways to gather and kind of flesh out some of these existential and open listening practices of really hearing what people were really feeling as much as what they were dealing with and what was at stake. For example, a marine scientist who's in a male-dominated world in deep-sea science has had to kind of practice in a certain way in order to survive and actually be seen legitimate. If she was starting to consider kind of the idea that ancestors in the sea, she would then she would be even more vulnerable as a woman. And for her to be able to articulate that. Another was a researcher discovering that one of the reasons why marine science was so dominated by white males and why out of all the sciences, deep-sea marine science was the least transformed, was that we discovered through her thinking and working with her students that there was a cultural barrier that a lot of people, young Nguni descendant people, they couldn't get permission to do marine science because it was the realm of the ancestors, and they would need permission from the ancestors to actually learn to dive or go under the waves. And so she actually changed her scholarship program to include for rituals and practices to ask for permission from the ancestors, for offerings to be made in order to get permission from their families to become marine scientists. And in the 6 or now 8 years, actually, since that early time of developing the proposal to now, there was a deep-sea marine cruise where all the scientists on the cruise were black and brown scientists, and there was even a Sangoma traditional healer on the cruise to bless the practice. So I was so wonderful to see that. Yesterday, David Group were talking about the sensitivity robots, but here there was a sensitivity of making offerings to the ocean before they sent down rovers to say, we know we're going to tend to a very sacred realm. We ask for permission to go and look for these particular things and nothing more. And so that sensitivity has developed, but with some generative tension.
Wonderful. So I hear in order to accomplish the work that you want to do, you actually have to be able to diagnose and then create bridges of connection that recognize the racial and gender norms and constraints in institutions and disciplines, and figure out ways to sort of transcend those and reformulate.
Yes. Yeah. I think one of the other crucial things we came across was the power of conviviality. That bringing people together not just to talk about their work, but to live together and be together, and us going on tour together, And we ended up realizing one of the most important indicators you can have for a transdisciplinary project like the MOTH, and like what we had in the hub, was actually to look to see if friendships were growing. So an indicator was friendships.
So how did you measure friendships growing?
Still hanging out, even if...
That people are still hanging out and choosing to work together and be together, even though if they've had several big struggles and sometimes big fights and fallouts, that they would return or come back to conferences or living Aulo events.
Or still sharing what we are experiencing in separate journeys of research and change, and checking in with each other and looking for insights in understanding those realities.
Wonderful. I'm going to pick up on a thread or a statement that you made, I believe, Dylan, in our meeting over at Forge, where you talked about the challenge of creating the conditions for listening, if I think I remember correctly. Can you explain to the audience what you meant by that and how you see both the dilemmas and the opportunities?
Yes. So I was really happy to hear people talking about empathy, and that's something that they want to talk about tomorrow. So I actually did my PhD on empathy, and I looked at it in the response of climate response. And there's three kind of components of empathy. So the one, from my perspective, is attentiveness, intuition, both the hocus pocus version, but also the one that you carry with you, like all the knowledge and context and cosmology you have with you, attentive intuition, and then listening. And one of the things that we really struggle with, I think, is that when groups come together, you come with an agenda, or you come with the thing that you want to be heard. And so if you can create any way in which there's space for someone to have an aspect of what they've brought to be heard, that parity, it should be one of your kind of central principles. And we've learned through art, and especially through storytelling practices, it can even be as simple as making a circle and getting a chance for everyone to speak. But we've learned in theatre, for example, if we can carefully research a crisis, try to get everyone's perspective as deep as possible, and then just show an aspect of that and we sometimes create something called a composite character, which is a character that's kind of troubles the fractions we see in society, and that character is struggling internally with the actual struggle we're seeing in that community or in that grappling, so that people can see themselves represented, they can feel slightly heard, we've learned much more open to listening in the post-show tribunal space to an alternative perspective. So it's kind of like Rumi's field, you're trying to fill that between right doing and wrong doing, there's a field, let's meet there. So it's that practice of spending a lot of time listening so that you can create figurations that you can share back, that people can see that a part of them has been seen and heard, that our colleague Kira calls, you then start developing an audience with ears to listen, an audience with ears. And that we need to spend as much time researching active, attentive listening as much as we are researching storytelling.
Wonderful. So I have two more questions, and I do want to say our next speaker is the Dean, and we're going to be waiting for him. So I don't want to exhaust you, but there are two awesome questions that I'll ask, and I think they're appropriate for either one or both of you to respond to, and then we'll see where we are. A lovely note of appreciation to the both of you for your work and leadership. Great thanks to you, Elisa, for your deeply thoughtful work as a UN Special Rapporteur on climate and human rights. Question that I think, Dylan, you could probably also answer. Can you tell us what your top two hopes for COP30 later this November are?
Well, one would be a space that's more open for the voices of those most affected by climate change to speak and be listened to. I mean, the space at the COP has been more and more close to any expression of truth around what climate change is and how it feels at the very hardest brunt of it. And of course, we'll never have any meaningful decision if those voices are not being heard. But maybe the other is, and it kind of goes back to the question you were asking, how do we cultivate a culture and a meaningful listening? And I think it might be holding accountable without shaming. So in human rights, we always talk about the naming and shaming, but I've become really worried about how the shaming is not working, and it's actually making people even less willing to listen, and creating more and more dangerous ways not to be even found themselves in a situation where they might hear. And I think one of the things with art, and I'm hoping COP30 might be a place, and many other, I think any other places we can think of where we can have those art research-based experiences, is a space where we can engage different cognitive capacities than the ones that are usually engaged in those meeting rooms, to empathize, to imagine, to connect with those experiences that some among us who are privileged enough have not had, of being mostly affected by climate change, and be ready to learn from that and deeply think about what can I do now to change the present now about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been going to COPs since COP 17. Not all of them, but it was in South Africa. I think that there's two things. One is that, and Merlin's here, so I think there's, my colleague Njaro Kalundu often uses the analogy of mushrooms, is that like a mushroom, when it comes out, it doesn't ask for permission from the mushroom next to it to kind of pierce through. It's got this community underground, and then it pierces through. And the COP17 that was in South Africa has a long history of arts-based civil disobedience and non-violent disobedience, but sometimes violent. But it was such a space in which it didn't ask for permission from the COP space to create solidarity practices and like long-form storytelling and call and response. So I'm hoping, because it's in Brazil, right, that the long history of like Paulo Freire and others of pedagogies of the oppressed, kind of those kinds of practices coming up. So I'm hoping that all the applied theatre practitioners and all the ways in which call and response has emerged there in such sophisticated and beautiful ways, really, there's a groundswell on the outskirts and inside, and insider-outsider relationships that help people come in and out and do political acupuncture. And then my second hope is that there's that same groundswell really starts to try dismantle the kind what we've noticed a lot around the corporate capture of COP. Oh no, the thing I actually wanted to say, sorry, was we got to perform at the Egypt COP. We took a play there, and we had a negotiator watch our play. It's an hour-long play, and she's been in the COP process for over 2 decades, and she was weeping at the end of the play and in the tribunal, and when she gave her testimony, she said this was the first time that her soul could show up at the COP. And it was like a landing strip for her soul. And that hearing a long-form storytelling, you know, the COP is just like 5-minute sound bites of like an indigenous leader is given like 5 minutes to express an entire cosmovision that spans millennia, and they get 5 minutes, whereas we had an hour and we could really go deep into all these complexities. So I think my hope for any of those global negotiating spaces is for long-form storytelling and not short-form.
Wonderful. Last and final question, and just I'd love to hear the top-of-mind answer. When you lie in bed or wake up in the morning and you're just super excited about that next thing that you're pursuing, that you're striving for, what is it?
To me, it's actually engaging children and those working on children's rights into this work, and maybe engaging more not only art-based but play-based approaches. And for adults to feel that they also have a license to play and to try and understand things in that imaginative, free way where we just care so much and we instinctively know what is right. So I'm hoping that might be the next evolution of the work.
Dylan?
Making things.
Like?
Making masks for a play, or making a giant map that retells the last 200 years of history for Zulu and Tsonga people, or working with wood carvers to try create the opposite of blackface, like a white mask that can show colonial presence, making things. My favorite artist is Joseph Beuys, who developed the field of social sculpture. And he said that no matter what theories or practices you're doing or what research you're doing, just keep making things. And I think making is such a profound, whether you're knitting or carving or drawing or singing in the shower, like making things.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking Dylan and